American Motors Corporation had almost no money left. Toyota was at the peak of its engineering confidence. One company built a compact SUV out of desperation, with a shrinking budget and engineers who were told to make it work regardless. The other built one by leveraging the full depth of an engineering culture that had internalized long-term durability as a core value. The Jeep Cherokee XJ went out of production in 2001. The community that formed around fixing it is still growing today. The Toyota 4Runner just kept going. It never broke down enough to make anyone write about it. Same era, same trails, same price. But only one of them became a legend. So, which philosophy actually builds a cult? The vehicle that needs you, or the one that doesn't? Let's begin with the one that needed you most. In 1984, a company on the verge of bankruptcy built a vehicle that would outlast the company itself by decades. American Motors Corporation did not have the resources to build the best compact SUV in the world. What they built instead was the most human one, the Jeep Cherokee XJ. It has a community so loud and so obsessive that it has outlived production by more than 20 years. Clean examples sell for more today than they did when they were new, and the people who own them will tell you about every repair they have ever made, in detail, whether you asked or not. So, how does a vehicle built on a shrinking budget, with borrowed parts and known weaknesses, become the most beloved off-road icon of its generation? To understand why the XJ is the way it is, you have to understand the financial condition of the company that built it. American Motors Corporation in the early 1980s was not a healthy organization. It was the smallest of the American manufacturers, perpetually outgunned by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler in terms of capital, dealer networks, and brand recognition. AMC survived by finding niches that the larger manufacturers had overlooked or abandoned. The Jeep brand, which AMC had acquired in 1970, was the most valuable thing they owned. It was also, by the early 80s, beginning to look dated. The full-size Jeep Cherokee was a body-on-frame relic in a market that was beginning to ask different questions. AMC needed a replacement, and they needed it without the kind of development budget that replacement deserved. The broader economic context matters here. By 1979, AMC had entered a partnership with Renault, the French state-owned automaker, which took a significant ownership stake in the company and injected the cash that made XJ development possible in the first place. The arrangement brought capital, technology sharing, and one other thing that turned out to be just as important. It brought François Castaing, a Renault engineer with a racing background, who was sent to Kenosha to lead AMC's product development. Castaing would become one of the two people most responsible for what the XJ became. The other was Roy Lunn, AMC's chief engineer for Jeep, who had been hired years earlier from Ford, where he had worked on the GT40 program and the Mustang One concept before going on to design the AMC Eagle. These were not conventional truck engineers. Lunn brought a chassis sensibility shaped by racing and sports cars. Castaing brought the discipline of a European product development culture that approached vehicles as integrated systems rather than collections of parts. Together they ran a team that was being asked to build the future of the compact SUV segment on a budget that any of the big three would have laughed at. The compact SUV market was emerging in the early 1980s. Vehicles like the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 and the early Bronco had demonstrated that there was demand for capable off-road vehicles that were smaller than a full-size truck. But the segment was still loosely defined. The Chevrolet S10 Blazer and Ford Bronco 2 were competing for the same space, but they were body-on-frame vehicles that prioritized ruggedness over refinement. AMC's leadership knew they needed a product in this space. They also knew they had almost no money to develop one. The engineers working on what would become the XJ were handed a brief that essentially said, "Build the future of this segment and do it cheaply." The decision that defined the XJ, to use unibody construction rather than the traditional body-on-frame architecture, was driven as much by economics as by engineering. A unibody structure is cheaper to manufacture at scale. It requires fewer components. It is lighter, which helps fuel economy figures at a moment when fuel economy was politically important. And for a company that could not afford to be wrong, it had the advantage of being genuinely innovative in a market where every other vehicle used a separate body and frame. Innovation is easier to sell than incremental improvement, and AMC needed to sell something. The XJ became the first American civilian 4x4 built with fully integrated unibody construction. Where a traditional truck engineer would have started with the frame and built up, Lunn and Castine started with the passenger compartment and worked outward. They were designing the XJ the way you would design a car, not a truck. The wheelbase was set at 101 4/10 inches, long enough for genuine interior space, but short enough to keep the vehicle maneuverable on trails and in urban parking. The track was kept wide relative to the vehicle's height to provide stability. The unibody structure was designed with rigidity as a primary goal, using high-strength steel in the critical load paths. The result was a vehicle that handled better than any truck of its size had a right to, precisely because it was not built like a truck. Here is the part of the XJ story that most retellings get wrong. The XJ had a solid front axle from the factory, a Dana 30, located by 4 trailing links and a track bar, and sprung with coil springs. This was the configuration Lunn designed, marketed by AAMC as Quadralink. Every other compact SUV of the era had independent front suspension. The XJ was the outlier. And the reason it worked, the reason the XJ rode and handled better on pavement than any of its competitors, was precisely that combination. A solid axle for durability and ground clearance, coils for articulation and compliance, and a stiff unibody tying the whole thing together. The rear was a solid axle on leaf springs, which was the one piece of conventional truck design the team kept for cost and simplicity. The XJ debuted as a 1984 model year vehicle in late 1983, and the reception was immediate and strong. That first year, it swept the 4x4 of the Year awards from the major off-road magazines, an unprecedented result for a genuinely new platform. Automotive journalists recognized that something different had arrived. The vehicle was lighter than its competitors by several hundred pounds. It was more car-like in its road behavior. The interior was more spacious than its exterior dimensions suggested, partly because the unibody construction allowed the engineers to reclaim space that a body-on-frame vehicle would waste in the gap between body and frame. AMC did not have the budget to develop a new engine for the XJ. The vehicle launched with the AMC 2.5-liter 4 and an optional GM-sourced 2.8-liter V6, neither of which was the engine the XJ would become famous for. That engine arrived in 1987, when the 4.0-liter inline-6 appeared. It was an evolution rather than a revolution. A larger displacement, revised cylinder head, and fuel injection fitted to a basic architecture whose roots went back decades. This is not an engine that was designed from a clean sheet with unlimited resources. It is an engine that was refined iteratively until it reached a state of functional excellence that nobody had quite planned for. That is an important distinction. The XJ's engine became great through necessity and time, not through intention. Chrysler acquired AMC in 1987, primarily because they wanted the Jeep brand. The acquisition, completed in August of that year for roughly $1.5 billion, would turn out to be one of the best investments in automotive history. Chrysler got AMC's manufacturing facilities, the Renault partnership, the model lineup, and Francois Castine himself, whose platform team approach to product development Chrysler would adopt company-wide and use to become, for a time, the most profitable of the big three. But what Chrysler really got was Jeep, and within Jeep, what they really got was the XJ. Chrysler looked at the XJ and made a decision that defined the vehicle's cultural legacy. They left it largely alone. This was partly financial. A complete redesign would have been expensive, and partly strategic. The XJ was selling. It was profitable. The formula worked. For the next 14 years, from 1987 to 2001, the XJ remained on sale with its core architecture unchanged. It received updated engines, revised interiors, and various equipment upgrades. In 1991, it gained the refined high-output version of the 4.0 inline-6 that the community worships. In 1997, it received updated styling, improved interior materials, and suspension revisions. But the bones were always the same. This longevity created something the engineers had not designed for. It created a parts ecosystem so deep and so mature that the vehicle became nearly indestructible by the sheer availability of everything it might need. A lift kit designed for an early XJ fits a late XJ. Axles interchange across the production run. The interchangeability was not planned as a community feature. It was a byproduct of a company that could not afford to redesign a vehicle that was already working. But it became the structural foundation of the most loyal owner community in the compact SUV world. When the XJ finally went out of production in 2001, replaced by the Liberty, which shared neither the XJ's dimensions, its construction method, nor its community's affection, nearly 3 million had been built, just under 2,885,000 to be exact. 3 million vehicles with the same fundamental DNA and an enormous aftermarket support structure is the foundation on which a community is built. And it turned out that a community, once built, is harder to destroy than any vehicle. The 4.0-liter AMC242 inline-6 is the engine that the XJ community worships. It produces 190 horsepower in the high-output specification it carried from 1991 onward, and 225 pound-feet of torque. These numbers are not impressive by modern standards, but the delivery of that torque is. The engine makes the majority of its pulling power below 3,000 revolutions per minute. This is exactly the right characteristic for a trail vehicle. On a steep rock ledge or a mud pit, you do not need an engine that revs enthusiastically to its red line. You need one that pulls strongly at low speed without drama. The AMC inline-6 does this with a naturalness that more powerful and more sophisticated engines often struggle to replicate. The block is cast iron. It is heavy, which is a disadvantage in terms of weight distribution and fuel economy, but cast iron has a thermal stability and a dimensional consistency under heat that aluminum cannot match. The engine runs hot on trail use. It runs hot in stop-and-go traffic on summer days. The cast iron block absorbs and manages this heat in a way that contributes directly to the engine's long service life. Examples with 300,000 miles on the original block are not uncommon in the XJ community. They are celebrated when they appear, photographed, documented, and shared as proof of the engine's fundamental character. The engine's greatest achievement is its simplicity: conventional valve train, generously sized cooling passages, adequate oil passages for sustained high-load operation. None of these things are spectacular. Together, they produce an engine that a reasonably competent mechanic can service completely with hand tools, a service manual, and a Saturday afternoon. This accessibility is not a luxury feature. It is a survival feature. The XJ's engine became beloved not because it was exotic, but because it was understandable. You could learn this engine, and in learning it, you could save yourself on a trail far from the nearest town. The four-wheel drive hardware underneath the XJ was largely industry-standard equipment rather than purpose-built components. The transfer cases were shared with other Chrysler products. The axles were Dana units used across multiple platforms. The advantage of this approach was massive parts availability and a deep aftermarket. The disadvantage was that the components were optimized for their individual functions, but not necessarily for the XJ's weight and intended use. The Dana 30 front axle was adequate for the XJ's weight and typical use. It is a well-understood piece of hardware with decades of aftermarket support. The Dana 35 rear axle is a different story. It is a light-duty unit designed for vehicles lighter than the XJ in serious use. When the vehicle is lifted and fitted with larger tires, as most enthusiast XJs eventually are, the increased leverage applied to the axle shafts exceeds what the Dana 35 was designed to handle. The axle shafts can shear. The differential can crack under load. On a street-driven stock XJ, it is adequate. On a modified trail vehicle, it is a liability waiting to express itself at the worst possible moment. What makes the Dana 35 story interesting is not the axle's weakness, it is the community's response to it. Rather than viewing the weak axle as a deal-breaker, the XJ community built an entire ecosystem around solving the problem. Chromoly axle shaft upgrades provided additional strength within the stock housing. Truss reinforcements welded to the axle housing prevented cracking under stress. And ultimately, the wholesale axle swap to the stronger Dana 44 unit sourced from Grand Cherokees or full-size trucks became the community's defining modification. The Dana 44 swap requires fabrication, patience, and a willingness to spend more money fixing a factory weakness than the vehicle originally cost to buy. Owners do it anyway. They document the process. They help others do it. And in doing so, they develop a level of mechanical competence that most drivers of more reliable vehicles never acquire. The suspension is the final engineering element that defines the XJ experience, and it is the one most commonly misunderstood. The front was a coil-sprung solid axle, Lund's Quadralink setup, with 4 locating links and a track bar. This was not independent front suspension. It was a solid axle chosen deliberately for ground clearance, durability, and articulation, and sprung with coils rather than leaves to give it the compliance and wheel travel that leaf-sprung competitors could not match. The rear was a solid axle on leaf springs, the simple, cheap, easy-to-modify configuration that was standard in trucks of the era. The lift kit market for the XJ is one of the largest in the off-road industry. The platform's signature community modification is not a front conversion. The front was already coil-sprung from the factory, but a rear leaf-to-coil conversion, which replaces the leaf-sprung rear with a coil-sprung, multi-link setup matched to the front. It transforms the XJ's articulation dramatically, and it exists because the factory rear, while adequate, was not good enough for the kind of use the community wanted to put it to. The front and rear both end up coil-sprung, solid axle, multi-linked, which is the configuration most serious off-road vehicles eventually arrive at, regardless of where they started. The XJ community did not form because the vehicle was perfect. It formed because the vehicle was fixable, and more than fixable. It was fixable by ordinary people with ordinary tools and an internet connection. When the XJ went out of production in 2001, prices dropped dramatically. A capable four-wheel drive vehicle with a proven engine and an enormous aftermarket was suddenly available for $2,000 to $5,000. The demographic that could access a vehicle at this price point was young, internet-connected, and mechanically curious, or at least willing to become mechanically curious out of necessity. This was the moment the modern XJ community took shape, and it shaped itself around a shared experience that the 4Runner community has never had and never will. The experience of the vehicle failing them in the field. The Dana 35 rear axle became the first shared crisis of the community. Owners who lifted their XJs and fitted larger tires quickly discovered that the factory axle was not designed for the additional stress. The axle shafts would shear on steep trails or during aggressive recovery situations. The community response was immediate and comprehensive. Threads were written. Solutions were tested. The Dana 44 axle swap became the community's defining modification, not a performance upgrade, but a correction of a factory shortcoming that every serious XJ owner eventually had to address. Owners who complete it emerge with a level of mechanical competence they did not have before. The XJ's weakness became the community's education. The head gasket failure on high-mileage examples was the second major community binding event. The 4.0 inline-6 ran hot in sustained use, and the head gasket on engines with over 150,000 miles was a known vulnerability. The diagnosis, a sweet smell from the exhaust, coolant in the oil, overheating on long climbs, was memorized by every XJ owner who spent any time in the community. The repair procedure was documented in exhaustive detail across dozens of forum threads, complete with the specific torque sequences for the head bolts, the brands of head gasket that failed prematurely, and the cooling system modifications that reduced the likelihood of recurrence. The first time you replaced a head gasket on an XJ, you were doing it with the guidance of a dozen people who had done it before you and documented every mistake they made. It was the closest thing to an apprenticeship that the internet has ever produced in mechanical work. The crankshaft position sensor was the community's most reliable villain. It fails without warning. It produces no symptoms until the moment it stops working, at which point the engine stops firing and the vehicle coasts to a halt. It can fail on the trail. It can fail on the highway. It can fail in a parking lot of a grocery store. The sensor costs less than $30. Replacing it takes 20 minutes with basic tools, but the first time it happens, it is terrifying. After the community has told you about it, it is a rite of passage. The fact that a $30 part can be identified, sourced, and replaced on the side of the road is not an embarrassment for the XJ. It is one of its defining virtues. The vehicle's simplicity, which contributed to its failure, also made that failure survivable. Forums formed first. JeepForum.com and later dedicated Cherokee-specific boards became repositories of institutional knowledge. Every failure mode was documented. Every repair procedure was written out with photographs. Every modification was rated and reviewed by people who had performed it in their driveways on Saturday afternoons. Then came YouTube, then the Facebook groups. Today there are dozens of active Cherokee XJ communities with tens of thousands of members, each one a living archive of everything that has ever gone wrong with this vehicle and exactly how to fix it. There is something else about the XJ that the specification sheets cannot capture. It is the way the vehicle looks when it has been used. A lifted XJ with mud in the wheel arches and a cracked front bumper and mismatched fender flares tells a story that a clean 4Runner with a factory roof rack does not. The XJ wears its history on the outside. Every modification, every repair, every trail scar is visible. The vehicle becomes a document of its owner's experience. You can read a Cherokee XJ the way you can read a person. The choices made, the battles fought, the compromises accepted. This is partly why the XJ has become such a dominant presence in the overland and off-road photography space. The vehicle photographs well precisely because it looks like it has been somewhere. The boxy silhouette against a mountain backdrop, the mud-caked undercarriage at a water crossing, the cracked windshield from a tree branch on a forest trail. These images are compelling not because the XJ is beautiful, but because it looks used in a way that communicates adventure and consequence. The 4Runner, being better engineered in every measurable way, also tends to look better at the end of a trail. Its better build quality means it accumulates less visible evidence of what it has been through. The 4Runner arrives at the trailhead the same way it leaves. The XJ arrives looking like it has been there already and came back for more. This visual language has translated directly into content culture. The XJ build thread, a documented progression from stock vehicle to finished project, complete with photographs of every stage, every failure, every repair, and every triumph, is one of the defining content formats of the four-wheel drive internet. Thousands of build threads exist across dozens of platforms. Each one is a narrative with a protagonist, a series of challenges, and a resolution. The format works because the XJ provides the raw material. Its imperfection is the story. The owner's response to that imperfection is the character development. The XJ earned its legend, but it earned it by being imperfect enough to need the people who loved it. That is what imperfection looks like when it is loved hard enough. A community of hundreds of thousands of people who know their vehicle's weaknesses better than its strengths and love it more because of them. But while the Cherokee was building its legend one breakdown at a time, Toyota was already finished building theirs. No broken axles, no midnight repairs, no community keeping it alive. Just a vehicle that came out of the factory already complete. So, what happens when nothing goes wrong? That question has an answer, and it might be the most uncomfortable one in this entire story. To find it, you have to go back to 1996, and the kind of engineering meeting that only happens when a company has nothing left to prove, and every resource it needs to prove it anyway. In late 1995, for the 1996 model year, Toyota introduced a significantly redesigned 4Runner built on an all-new body and chassis developed under chief engineer Masaki Ishiko. The third-generation 4Runner was not designed in isolation. It shared its chassis with the Land Cruiser Prado and its engines and transmissions with the first-generation Toyota Tacoma. This platform sharing was not a compromise. It was a strength. Toyota's truck and SUV programs were built around the idea that the same validated, over-engineered components should serve multiple vehicles, because the engineering cost of doing something properly once was easier to justify when the result could be used 3 times. This is a fundamentally different starting point from the one AMC engineers faced a decade earlier. One team was asking what they could get away with. The other was asking what they could leverage. It is one of the most reliable vehicles ever produced in its segment. Examples with 300,000 miles on the original engine are not remarkable. They are expected. The survival rate of the platform is among the highest of any four-wheel drive vehicle from its era. And yet, it never inspired the kind of obsession the Cherokee did. Toyota, in the mid-1990s, was not a company making decisions under financial duress. It was a company at the peak of its engineering confidence. The Lexus LS 400 had demonstrated 4 years earlier that Japanese engineering could set the standard for any product category it chose to enter. The Land Cruiser was already legendary for its durability in the most demanding conditions on Earth. The Hilux Surf, which the international market knew as the 4Runner, had a reputation that its second-generation platform had earned through genuine capability. The third generation was a continuation of that trajectory. Toyota's approach to the third-generation 4Runner reflected an engineering culture that had internalized the idea that a vehicle's real test came not in the first year of ownership, but in the 5th, the 10th, the 15th. The company's trucks and SUVs had a global reputation for long-term reliability that was worth more than any marketing campaign could generate. Protecting that reputation was not a marketing objective. It was an engineering constraint. Every component had to be specified, not for what was adequate, but for what would still be functioning when the vehicle reached its second owner and its third. The decision to use a ladder frame rather than a unibody structure was deliberate and considered. Toyota's engineers understood the advantages of unibody construction. The XJ had demonstrated them clearly. But they also understood the long-term vulnerabilities. A unibody structure in a vehicle that would spend its life in harsh conditions was a structural liability that compounded over time. A properly designed ladder frame was heavier and less efficient, but it was more repairable after serious off-road damage, and provided a more stable foundation for the suspension geometry the engineers wanted to use. The ladder frame Toyota chose used fully boxed rails, closed sections of steel rather than the open C-channel sections that had been standard in truck construction for decades. The boxing added stiffness without proportionally adding weight. Toyota also applied anti-corrosion treatments to cavities and seams with a thoroughness that was culturally characteristic of the company. These decisions added cost, they added weight, they added complexity to the manufacturing process. Toyota made them anyway. The irony, which the community acknowledges openly, is that even with all that care, the third-gen 4Runner frame is still vulnerable to rust in salt belt states, just less so than its competitors. The front suspension of the third-generation 4Runner is independent double wishbone with torsion bars. It is more complex than the coil-sprung solid axle Lund put under the XJ. It requires more precise manufacturing, and it produces a vehicle that handles with a fluency and composure on pavement that no solid axle competitor could match. The double wishbone setup works by allowing each front wheel to travel independently through its range of motion while maintaining the wheel's camber angle through most of the range. When a wheel hits a bump, it moves up without dramatically affecting the other wheel's contact patch. This is the same geometry used in sports cars and racing vehicles. Toyota put it on a compact SUV because they wanted the 4Runner to be as good on the road as it was on the trail. The penalty for this sophistication was a weaker front axle than a solid axle setup could provide. The constant velocity joints that allow the front wheels to steer, while the independent suspension works, are not as strong as the solid axle shafts of a Dana 30 setup. This is a known limitation that the 4Runner community acknowledges, but it is a limitation that appears at the extreme end of off-road use, the kind of use that represents a tiny fraction of actual 4Runner ownership. The XJ's solid front axle was the more capable off-road choice at the extremes. The 4Runner's independent front suspension was the more capable everyday choice everywhere else. Both were legitimate engineering decisions reached from different starting assumptions. The rear suspension was a solid axle on coil springs, the configuration that provides the best combination of articulation and on-road stability available in conventional truck design. The coil springs allowed significantly more rear-wheel travel than the XJ's leaf-sprung rear. This is one of the few areas where the 4Runner was unambiguously ahead of the XJ in stock form, because the XJ's rear leaves were a cost-driven compromise, and the 4Runner's rear coils were the result of an engineering team that had the budget to do it properly. The locking rear differential was a factory option that deserves specific attention because it represents a philosophical statement about what kind of vehicle Toyota was building. It was not standard across the lineup. It was available on specific trims and option packages, and owners who specified it got the most effective traction aid available for off-road use in a compact SUV of the era. Most manufacturers of the era, including Chrysler, did not offer a factory rear locker on compact SUVs at all. Toyota offered it because their engineers decided that a vehicle marketed for off-road use should actually be capable of serious off-road use when a customer wanted that capability. The 3.4-liter V6 engine, designated the 5VZ-FE, is a study in the kind of engineering discipline that produces reliable rather than spectacular results. In the 4Runner, it produces 183 horsepower and 217 pound-feet of torque. The same engine in the Tacoma was rated slightly higher, at 190 horsepower and 220 pound-feet. The small difference between the two applications was not an accident. Toyota tuned the 4Runner's calibration for slightly different characteristics to match the heavier vehicle and its expected use pattern. In absolute horsepower, the 5VZ-FE trails the XJ's 4.0 inline-6. What it gives you in exchange is the kind of smoothness and refinement that an iron block pushrod-era architecture cannot approach. The engine is built from a cast iron block with aluminum heads, a combination that gives it the thermal stability of iron where it matters and the weight savings of aluminum where it matters less. The cylinder heads are dual overhead cam, 4 valves per cylinder, well designed for efficient breathing. The fuel injection system is precise. The engine management calibration is conservative, prioritizing longevity over outright performance. The reliability record of this engine is extraordinary. Consumer data, professional mechanic testimony, and enthusiast forum consensus all point to the same conclusion. The 5VZ-FE V6 does not fail in normal use. It fails when maintenance is neglected. It fails when the timing belt is not replaced at the specified interval. With proper maintenance, examples with over 300,000 miles on the original engine are documented and unremarkable. The build quality of the third-generation 4Runner is visible in details that most owners never examine, and that advertising never mentions. The wiring harnesses are over-insulated for the operating temperature range. The connectors are sealed against moisture intrusion. The cooling system is designed with enough thermal margin that the engine runs well within its operating range, even in sustained high-load conditions. These are invisible qualities. They produce no exciting performance statistics. They accumulate over time as a vehicle that simply continues to work when its contemporaries begin to fail. The third-generation 4Runner's failure points are known and discussed in enthusiast circles. The timing belt is a maintenance item that requires replacement at around 90 to 100,000 miles. Owners who neglect this can suffer catastrophic engine damage. The rear differential pinion seal can develop a slow leak on high-mileage examples. Frame rust is a genuine concern in salt belt states. The power steering rack can develop play after extended use. Read that list again. It is the failure list for a vehicle that has been in service for 25 years. The timing belt is a scheduled maintenance item. Its failure is a maintenance failure, not a mechanical one. The pinion seal is a sealing component that wears in any differential over time. Frame rust is the one genuinely serious item, and it is a slower, less dramatic problem than the unibody rust that compromises an XJ structurally. Compare this to the XJ's failure list. Head gaskets, Dana 35 axle shafts, crankshaft position sensors, electrical gremlins, unibody rust that compromises the structural integrity of the entire vehicle. The comparison is not close. The 4Runner's reliability is its defining characteristic and its cultural liability simultaneously. Because the vehicle rarely breaks, its owners have almost nothing to bond over in terms of shared crisis. The XJ community has thousands of stories that begin with the words, "I was 40 miles from the nearest town," and end with something having been repaired using available materials and community knowledge. The 4Runner community has far fewer of those stories, because the 4Runner rarely puts its owners in that situation. This matters for a specific reason. Community is not built by things going right. Community is built by things going wrong together. The XJ created a community of people who had all been in the same situation, stranded, resourceful, and ultimately successful, and who recognized each other's experience when they met. The 4Runner created a community of people who had all been somewhere beautiful without incident. Both are positive experiences, but only one of them creates the kind of bond that lasts decades and generates passionate online communities. The 4Runner community exists. It is smaller, quieter, and more cerebral than the XJ community. Its members tend to discuss capability and adventure rather than repair and survival. The shared content is more likely to be a trail run video than a repair tutorial. The advice given in 4Runner groups tends toward preventive maintenance and equipment selection rather than emergency diagnosis and field repair. This is not a lesser community. It is a different one, shaped by the different experiences the vehicle creates. But it has never achieved the evangelical intensity of the XJ community because the vehicle has never demanded that intensity from its owners. In terms of factory off-road capability, the comparison is more nuanced than it first appears. The 4Runner's superior rear suspension, available factory locker, and build quality give it an overall advantage out of the box. The XJ's solid front axle is genuinely more capable than the 4Runner's independent front at the extremes of off-road use. The XJ will tolerate impacts and articulation that will break CV joints on a 4Runner. For most trail use, the 4Runner's balance wins. For the extreme end, the XJ's front end is the more durable piece of hardware. In terms of reliability, the comparison is not close. The 4Runner is significantly more reliable than the XJ across every metric available. Consumer data, mechanic testimony, long-term ownership cost, survival rate among produced examples. The 4Runner wins every category, and it does not win narrowly. In terms of on-road dynamics, the 4Runner is the superior vehicle. The independent front suspension, the better noise isolation, the more refined powertrain, and the more ergonomic interior make it a more pleasant vehicle to drive every day. The XJ's on-road dynamics are acceptable for a vehicle of its age, but they communicate their compromises through noise, vibration, and handling that requires more driver input than the 4Runner demands. In terms of long-term durability, the 4Runner's survival rate among produced examples is meaningfully higher than the XJ's. More 4Runners from this era are still on the road in good condition because more of them were maintained adequately and fewer of them were compromised structurally. The unibody construction that made the XJ innovative in 1984 became its structural liability as it aged. In dry climates, XJs survive. In salt belt states, they disappear at a rate that tells the full story of unibody construction in a vehicle that was used as hard as its owners used it. The 4Runner's body-on-frame structure is more forgiving of rust. The frame itself can rust badly before the body is compromised. In terms of modified capability, the gap narrows dramatically. The XJ's aftermarket support is extraordinary. A fully built XJ, rear coil conversion, Dana 44 axle swap, proper suspension lift, appropriate tires, is a genuinely formidable off-road vehicle that rivals purpose-built machines costing several times as much. The modification potential of the platform is one of its genuine strengths, but it is worth noting that the gap between stock and modified on the XJ represents the gap between what the vehicle was and what it needed to be. In terms of cultural impact, the XJ wins comprehensively. The community it created is larger, more passionate, more productive of content and culture, and more evangelical in its loyalty than any community the 4Runner has generated. Think about what the average XJ owner's first year looks like compared to the average 4Runner owner's first year. The 4Runner owner changes the oil, checks the fluids, maybe adds a roof rack, and drives it to the trailhead. The XJ owner changes the oil, discovers a slow coolant leak, fixes the leak, discovers the leak was hiding a compromised hose that was also affecting the heater, fixes that, takes it on a trail run, breaks a rear axle shaft 30 miles from the nearest town, calls someone from the forum they joined 2 weeks ago, gets the part overnighted to a nearby hardware store, and drives home on a repaired axle with a story they will tell for the rest of their life. One of those experiences builds a relationship with a machine. The other builds familiarity. This is the uncomfortable center of the XJ's legend. The vehicle's cultural status is not primarily a product of its engineering. It is a product of its imperfections. The XJ became legendary not because it was great, but because it was human. It failed in human ways, in human situations, and it relied on human ingenuity to survive. Is the legend earned? The XJ community will tell you the legend is earned. They will point to the vehicle's genuine off-road capability, its accessibility, its modification potential, and its long production run as evidence of a vehicle that deserved the love it received. They are not wrong about any of those things. But the love is all in part a product of necessity. The XJ is loved the way people love things that have cost them something. The hours spent diagnosing electrical faults, the money spent on axle upgrades, the weekends given to lift installations. These are not pleasant experiences in themselves, but they are bonding experiences. They create stories, and stories are the raw material of legend. There is a psychological phenomenon that researchers have studied extensively in other contexts that applies directly here. When people invest significant effort into something, when they struggle with it, sacrifice for it, and ultimately succeed with it, they value the result more highly than if it had been easy. This is true of academic achievements, of relationships, of creative projects. It is also true of vehicles. The XJ owner who spent 3 weekends diagnosing and replacing a crankshaft position sensor values the vehicle more highly than they would if it had simply worked. Toyota's engineers eliminated the conditions for that process. They built a vehicle so good that its owners never had to struggle with it in the same way. The owners were spared the frustration and the expense and the lost weekends, but they were also spared the attachment, the meaning, and the pride that come from overcoming those things. The used market for both vehicles tells a story that no amount of specification comparison can. Clean, unmodified XJs have become genuinely scarce. The vehicles were used hard. Many were modified in ways that compromised their structural integrity or their mechanical condition. Rust eliminated a significant portion of the examples produced in cold weather states. And the demand from the enthusiast community, people who will pay a premium for a clean, stock XJ as a blank canvas for a build, has absorbed supply faster than it can be generated. Clean third-generation 4Runners also command strong prices, often stronger in absolute terms because the baseline condition of surviving examples is better. The market correctly identifies the 4Runner as the more durable investment, but the 4Runner buyer is often making a straightforward transaction. They are buying a reliable vehicle with proven longevity at a fair price for what they are getting. The XJ buyer is often making an emotional transaction. They are buying into something larger than the vehicle. 2 vehicles, same era, same trails, completely different outcomes. The 4Runner was built by an engineering culture that believed durability was the highest standard. It is one of the most reliable and capable compact SUVs ever made. It continues to perform its function long after its competitors have rusted, broken, and been forgotten. It is the vehicle that the data recommends. It is the vehicle that rational analysis selects. The XJ was built by engineers working with inadequate resources who produced something unexpectedly significant. Roy Lund designed a coil-sprung solid front axle nobody else in the segment would attempt. Francois Castaing ran a product development operation that would eventually teach Chrysler how to build cars. And the weaknesses that slipped through, the Dana 35, the cooling system margins, the unibody rust, became the community's greatest gifts, not to the engineers who created them, but to the owners who had to live with them. The 4Runner is the vehicle that a rational person chooses. The XJ is the vehicle that an emotional person loves. And in a world that increasingly optimizes for rationality, vehicles with digital assistance, predictive maintenance systems, and engineering margins so wide that nothing ever goes wrong, the XJ stands as a reminder of what we lose when we build things that never need us. Modern SUVs are sealed units. They diagnose themselves. They update their own software overnight. They are, by any engineering standard, vastly superior to both the XJ and the 4Runner. They are also, by any cultural standard, almost completely loveless. Nobody is writing forum posts at midnight about the deep pleasure of diagnosing a sensor fault on a modern crossover. The vehicles work too well to create that kind of relationship. The XJ anticipated none of this. It was not trying to be imperfect enough to be loved. It was trying to be the best vehicle AMC could produce with the budget and technology available in 1983. The imperfections were genuine, not calculated. The community was not engineered. It simply happened in the way that communities happen around things that require people to show up and participate. A vehicle that never needs you will never inspire the kind of love that the XJ inspires. It will never generate the community, the culture, or the legend. It will simply work. And working is enough. Working is admirable. Working is what good engineering produces. But it is not what legends are made of. Legends are made of things that cost you something. The XJ cost its owners time, money, skill, patience, and occasionally their dignity in the middle of a trail in the middle of nowhere. In return, it gave them something no amount of Toyota engineering could manufacture: a story worth telling, a community worth belonging to, an identity worth having. The 4Runner is the better vehicle. The XJ is the better legend. And perhaps the most honest conclusion is that we need both. We need the engineers who build things properly, and we need the imperfect machines that remind us we are capable of fixing what breaks. Because in a world of vehicles that increasingly do everything for you, there is something important about a machine that occasionally makes you do something for it. Now, click on this next video if you want to see where this obsession with imperfect, overloved Japanese machines leads. Because the same era that produced the 4Runner also produced two of the most over-engineered luxury cars of the 20th century. Lexus LS 400 versus the Mercedes W124. Toyota spent $1 billion to embarrass Stuttgart. Mercedes never admitted it lost. It is right there on your screen.